What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm in Austin, Texas, hanging out in the camper. It's raining outside, but I just got done getting all of my tackle and the boat ready for my very first MLF Bass Pro Tour event here on Lake Travis. It's pretty exciting because I qualified for this event through my 6th place finish at Lake Okeechobee earlier this year, and so this is kind of a bonus tournament. I get to go out there, not have to worry about points, none of that. I just get to compete against the guys that I've been big fans of for many years and have idolized for many years, growing up. So that's going to be really exciting. If you're watching this prior to that event, make sure you keep up with all the live coverage. Hopefully I'll be on their live, have a camera on me at some point and be on their live coverage. But of course you can watch all that at majorleaguefishing.com. But since I just got done kind of going through all my tackle, getting my rods and reels all ready and spooled up with Seagar, I wanted to go ahead and do a video on how I choose a reel based on the gear ratio that I need for a certain situation. It's a question that I get a lot. A lot of people want to know, how do I choose a certain gear ratio for a certain technique? And so I'm going to kind of break down my process of elimination for gear ratios. So first off, here are the reels that I'm using. These are the bait casting reels that I'm using. We've got the Fitzgerald Fishing Stunner reel. I started using this 3 years ago, and really love this reel. It's a workhorse, really great little reel that has won me a lot of money. And then most recently, they've introduced the new VLD 10. This has a 10+1 bearing system, comes in several different gear ratios, and on all of these I'm using left-handed retrieve. That's what I like. I'm right-handed, but I like that left-handed retrieve because I really think that it makes me more efficient. It just seems more natural to me. So these are the two types of reels that I'm using out there on the water, but these are the 3 different gear ratios. We've got a 6.2 to 1, and anything in that range is going to be what we're going to be talking about. Actually, it's a 6.3 to 1 in the Stunner, and so if the reel that you're looking at, like in the VLD 10s, I think it's a 6.8 to 1. If it's a 6.1 to 1, all very similar. So if it's not the exact number, just kind of in that ballpark, that's what we're talking about. And so we've got the 6.3 to 1, which I call the 6 gear ratio, and then we go up to the 7 gear ratio. This is a 7.2 to 1. And then we've got the ultra fast 8.1 to 1. So anything in that 8 range is a really fast reel. So the first thing I want to mention is that really one of the misconceptions is that gear ratio is the only factor that you're looking at when you're looking at how fast you're retrieving your line and your bait. Really, there's other factors, including the diameter of the spool. Just kind of think of it this way. It's kind of hard to explain, but if you had a very narrow diameter spool, it would take much longer for you to wrap the same amount of line onto that spool as opposed to a bigger diameter spool. So even though you might have a lower gear ratio reel, if it has a spool that's of a wider diameter, especially on the length of a cast, it still has plenty of line on there, that spool is probably going to reel in faster than a faster gear ratio reel that has a lot less diameter to the spool on the length of a cast. So if that makes any sense to you, but that's one thing you need to think about is not necessarily just the gear ratio, but also the diameter of the spool. It's really important to think about that when it comes to the retrieve speed. And a lot of the things that you're really trying to take into consideration with the speed of the gear ratio is the type of power and the type of fatigue that you're going to be experiencing with different gear ratios with the techniques that you're using. For instance, with a crankbait, it would be really hard for you to reel a crankbait all day long. A deep diving crankbait on a high speed gear ratio, so like at 8.1 to 1, would really wear you out. But that lower gear ratio, just like on a bike, you know, the lower gear ratios are going to be a lot better for going uphill and those real strenuous terrain situations. And the same thing with a bait casting reel. A 6.3 to 1 or something in that 6 range is going to be a lot better at cranking those high resistance baits like a deep diving crankbait. It allows you to throw those baits all day long and have a lot less fatigue. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind first off. All right, so let's dive into where I use each of these reel gear ratios and what type of techniques I'm going to be using. So let's start with the 6 gear ratio, the 6.3 to 1, a stunner here. Or, you know, if I'm throwing the VLD10, again, it's a 6.8 to 1, but very similar. This lower speed gear ratio, and they make them a lot lower. Back in the day, you know, the 4s and the 5s were really popular, but nowadays really a 6.1 to 1 or 6.3 to 1, that's going to be my lowest gear ratio, because I really think that it allows me to reduce the amount of fatigue that I experience, you know, throwing deep diving crankbaits and those high resistance baits, but still allows me to be really efficient. So the 6.3 to 1 is going to be my choice in a lot of situations during the winter time where I don't want to overpower a bait. I don't want to move it really fast. You know, something like a chatterbait in cold water, a spinnerbait in cold water, and also my crankbaits. Any of the crankbaits that I'm throwing, whether it's shallow, medium divers, or deep divers, I like a 6.3 to 1 gear ratio for that, and that's because, like, when I cast it out there, and you know, I just naturally like to burn things in, so I'm reeling real fast, and the 6.3 to 1 allows me to reel it really fast. I'm not wearing myself out, but at the same time, I'm not overworking those diving plugs. So I really like the lower speed gear ratio. And again, in the colder water situations, anytime I'm using a moving bait that I want it to go a little bit slower, and I don't want to overpower it, the lower gear ratio is going to do the trick. Another thing is like an Alabama rig. Again, an Alabama rig is one of those baits that's really hard to throw all day long. But on a lower gear ratio reel, it's going to be a whole lot easier to throw that Alabama rig all day long on the lower gear ratio. It's really hard to throw it a big A rig on, you know, either of these faster gear ratios for any length of time. So those are the situations I'm going to be using the lower gear ratio. Crankbaits and cold water and situations where I want reaction baits to move real slow. The one thing I will say about the lower gear ratio is that I never use it for bottom bouncing techniques or flipping and pitching. Those are things that I don't use it for, and I also don't use them for topwater baits. I really like the option to have a faster reel, but we'll talk about those with these. So let's move on to the 7.2 to 1. So the 7 range, this is my most used gear ratio. I use this a lot, you know, for reaction baits, like, you know, that aren't crankbaits. So I use it for jerk baits. I use it for my chatterbaits, my swim jigs, my swim baits. A lot of my swim baits, like if they're smaller swim baits, if they're bigger swim baits, I'll probably use the lower gear ratio. But, you know, I use it for a lot of things. And I also use it for all my bottom bouncing techniques. Well, not all. We actually will use some with the 8.1 to 1. But this is my workhorse. It's just a really good balance. Allows me to be very efficient, make really quick presentations, reel back in real fast, and also is not so high of a gear ratio that it's going to wear me out with some of the heavier baits. So this one, I'm going to be using all my Texas rigs, you know, football heads, a lot of of Carolina rigs. All those bottom bouncing baits work really well on a 7.2 to 1. And again, those reaction baits in warm water where I'm trying to cover a lot of water, that's when I'm going to be using the 7.2 to 1. So if you're looking for one reel gear ratio to cover the most situations, by far nowadays in bass fishing, back in the day this would have been an extremely fast reel, but nowadays this is the gold standard. So 7.2 to 1 is a good one. But moving on to the 8.1 to 1. The 8.1 to 1 and those really ultra fast reels nowadays, it's a great category of gear ratio, but it also has limitations. Again, it's going to wear you out a lot faster than these other two. It generally will reel in your bait a lot faster, so it's really good for those techniques where you're trying to reel in slack real fast, like when you're working a jerk bait or you're working a topwater. Those are the type of situations I like to use the 8.1 to 1. Now, I'll also use it in deeper water situations. If I'm fishing a bait on the bottom in deep water where, after I get that bait out of the strike zone, I want to reel it in real fast and make another presentation, the 8.1 to 1 is really good for, just pure efficiency. But generally, with my walking topwater baits and all those topwater baits where you actually have to work it like a popper or a Zara spook or, some type of like pencil popper or something like that, this is the reel that I'm going to be using. Now, if it's like a buzz bait or a whopper plopper, I'm probably going to be using the 7.2 to 1 a little bit more, because I don't want to, again, I don't want to overpower and move too fast. But any situation where I'm using a bait where I'm creating slack by jerking that rod tip, and I want to just reel in that slack, 8.1 to 1 works really good. So that's really my basic process for using for figuring out which gear ratio I want to use. So I want to hear what you guys have to say. What is your favorite gear ratios, and what type of techniques do you use them for? It really has a lot to do with personal preference. Beyond some of the fundamental factors that we talked about, as far as working baits that really could wear you out in a day. A lot of it has to do with your personal preference. So I definitely want to hear about that in the comments section. Other than that, wish me luck this week here on Travis. It's going to be fun fishing the MLF BPT event here, stage 2. And yeah, make sure you like, share, subscribe, and I'm going to see you guys out on the water and out on live too.